Have you ever wondered if your VA disability and pension payments are, truly keeping up with the rising cost of living? Because the numbers are in, and what happens over these next 3 months will directly dictate your benefits for all of next year.
Yeah, and what is genuinely wild about this system is that the exact dollar amount a veteran in Ohio receives next January it might literally be decided by what a gallon of gas costs this August. We are sitting in the most critical calculation window of the entire year right now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Veterans Briefing. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the newest 2027 cost of living adjustment, the CLAO projections, based on the recent June 2026 inflation data.
Right, and our mission today is to really explain the actual mechanisms behind how those numbers impact your VA benefits. Plus, we'll be exploring the geopolitical factors that could unexpectedly shift your final payout.
Exactly. We want to cut through the jargon and just look at the real-world math. So to start, for anyone who might be navigating the benefit system for the first time, we have to look at how these increases are fundamentally structured.
Yeah, it's a good place to start.
Right. Because the Department of Veterans Affairs doesn't actually calculate its own cost of living increase for disability compensation. They simply mirror whatever the Social Security Administration puts in place.
They do, yeah. The linkage there is statutory, and it's basically designed for bureaucratic efficiency.
Just to keep things simple.
Exactly. Back in the 1970s, when automatic cost of living adjustments were first legislated for Social Security, to keep seniors afloat against inflation,
Right.
Congress eventually decided that veterans shouldn't be subjected to a separate, potentially unequal economic metric.
That makes sense. You don't want two different sets of math for people on fixed incomes.
Precisely. When Social Security calculates their adjustment, the VA is legally bound to adopt that exact same percentage. So when we track Social Security's economic data, we are directly tracking your future VA pay.
Which brings us to the actual projections that just dropped for 2027. We're looking at two major independent forecasts today, and they were painting a very specific picture.
They are.
The Senior Citizens League, which is a nonpartisan group that models these numbers every year, is projecting a 3.8% increase.
Yeah, well, Mary Johnson, who is a highly respected independent Medicare and Social Security analyst, is projecting a slightly lower figure of 3.7%.
Okay, so 3.8 versus 3.7.
Right. And what really stands out here is the tight consensus. Even though they use slightly different internal models to forecast the upcoming months, they are landing within 0.1% of each other.
That's incredibly close. So let's ground those percentages in reality for you, the listener, and talk about what a 3.8% bump actually looks like in your bank account.
Let's do the math.
Yeah. Last year, the official CLA figure was 2.8%.
Yeah.
So if we take an average baseline VA compensation figure, say $1,937.53 a month, a 3.8% CLA would add an extra $73.62 every single month.
Right.
That brings your new total up to $2,011.15.
And breaking that $2,000 threshold is a tangible psychological and financial milestone for a lot of households.
Oh, it's absolutely.
Extrapolating that $73 over a full 12 months, you're looking at nearly $900 in additional compensation for the year. That is designed specifically to buffer against the rising costs at the grocery store and the gas pump.
Right, and that extra $900 sounds helpful, but I want to push back on these projections for a second.
Sure.
Because Mary Johnson actually dropped her estimate down a full percentage point recently. She went from forecasting a 4.7% increase earlier this year down to this new 3.7%.
She did, yeah.
And a full percentage point drop in the forecasting world is massive. Why the sudden drop, and what is that telling us about the inflation we're actually experiencing on the ground?
Well, to understand why a veteran analyst like Johnson would pull her forecast down so aggressively, we really have to look at the raw economic data that came out of June.
Okay.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics released their Consumer Price Index for June 2026, and the data showed a significant, unexpected economic cooldown. The overall inflation rate dropped down to 3.5%.
But a cool down doesn't mean prices are actually dropping, though, right? It just means the speed at which everything is getting more expensive has slowed down.
Exactly. That is a crucial distinction. Prices are still going up, just not as violently as they were in the spring. But, and here's the kicker, the government doesn't use the overall inflation rate to calculate your benefits.
They don't.
No, they use a very specific submetric called the CPI-W.
Right, the CPI-W.
Yeah, that stands for the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers.
Okay, I have to stop you there because this always bothers me. Why on earth does the pay of a disabled military veteran rely on an index measuring urban wage earners and clerical workers.
I know, it sounds ridiculous.
It sounds like a metric for office staff in a city, not a retired mechanic living in a rural area.
It does, and it is entirely a legacy system, and frankly, a historical relic.
Really?
Yeah. When automatic collatés were established back in 1972, the CPI-W was literally the only consumer price index the government tracked.
Oh, wow. So they just didn't have anything else.
Exactly. They didn't have a broader index for the general population or the elderly yet. So they tied benefits to the only ruler they had in the drawer, so to speak. And even though they developed more inclusive metrics later on, the law tethering your benefits to the CPI-W was just never updated.
That is wild.
Yeah. So the June CPI-W came in at an index level of 327.075.
Which is just a random string of decimal points until we compare it to the baseline.
Right, exactly.
The established CLA baseline, the number we actually have to beat to get an increase, is 317.265. So that June figure sits 3.1% above the baseline.
Showing us that the intense inflation we saw heating up earlier in the year really started to chill out as we moved into the summer. But the overarching question is why it chilled so fast.
Yeah, I look at the breakdown of those June numbers, and there was one massive driver behind this sudden economic cooldown. Gas prices.
That's prices, yep.
They plummeted in June by a staggering 9.7% over a single month. But how does a drop in just one commodity drag the entire national inflation average down by a full percentage point?
It basically comes down to how the Bureau of Labor Statistics weights the index.
Okay, what do you mean by weights?
Well, the CPI-W isn't just a simple average of every item in the economy. They assign different weights to different categories based on how much of their budget an average person spends on them.
Ah, got it.
Yeah, so transportation and energy are heavily weighted categories because they are non-negotiable everyday expenses.
So think of the CPI-W like a massive grocery cart. Even if the price of the bread, the milk, and the eggs in that cart are all creeping up, if a quarter of the cart is filled with gasoline and gas goes on a massive 10% clearance sale, the total receipt at the register is still going to drop.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
The sheer weight of the gas prices overpowered the rising costs of housing and food.
Exactly. Because transportation costs factor so heavily into that index, when gas prices fall off a cliff, it drags the entire weighted average down with it.
Makes sense.
And Mary Johnson pointed out that seeing a significant drop in inflation during the month of June is incredibly rare. Looking at the last 5 years of CPI data, you almost never see a dip like this right at the start of summer driving season.
Right, because everyone is road tripping and traveling. But if June's numbers brought the projections down, it is crucial to understand that June's numbers do not actually lock in the final VA pay increase.
Yeah, they don't.
The 3.1% we just talked about doesn't dictate your January paycheck.
Real quick, though, if you're finding these discussions helpful, please subscribe to Veterans Briefing so you never miss important updates and practical information for veterans and their families.
Absolutely. So we know June caused a stir and forced analysts to revise their math, but June is essentially just the warm-up act for the real show.
Yeah, the warm-up act is a good way to put it. The actual COLA percentage that will determine your 2027 pay is calculated using a very rigid, hyper-specific 3-month window.
Okay.
The government only looks at the CPI-W data from the third quarter of the calendar year, so July, August, and September.
Just those 3 months.
Only those 3. They take the index numbers from July, August, and September, average them together, and compare that final average against the baseline we mentioned earlier.
Right.
Whatever that percentage difference is, that becomes the official mathematically locked COLA. We don't even have the July numbers yet. I mean, the Bureau of Labor Statistics won't release those until August 12th.
I always hear people ask why the government doesn't just use the whole year's average. Like, why base a 12-month benefit on a 3-month snapshot?
It is purely a matter of bureaucratic timing.
Just logistics.
Yeah, they need the data from July through September so they can run the final calculations in October. Once the percentage is locked in October, the VA and Social Security need November and December to physically update their computer systems.
To adjust the Treasury disbursements and all that?
Exactly, and mail out the updated benefit letters so that the new amounts actually hit bank accounts on January 1st. If they waited for data from October or November, they could never program the changes in time for the new year.
Which means right now, as we record this in the middle of summer, we are actively sitting in the countdown where the data actually counts.
We are.
The money you spend today, the prices on the shelves right now, this is what is going into the final mathematical formula.
creating a fascinating and honestly almost uncomfortable paradox for veterans and seniors relying on fixed incomes.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Because of this rigid 3-month window, the ideal situation for your key OA calculation is actually for inflation to run incredibly hot right now.
It is.
You technically want to feel the financial pain of high gas and expensive groceries during July, August, and September, because that suffering drives your future pay percentage upward.
And then theoretically, you want the broader economy to cool way down in October, November, and December.
Right.
If prices drop right before those new higher checks start hitting your bank account, your purchasing power increases significantly. You essentially lock in a high permanent raise based on temporary summer inflation.
It is a bizarre psychological friction.
Yes.
You know, to stand at the gas pump in August, wince at a $4 a gallon price tag, and realize that you are actually banking that pain for a higher payout next year.
It's a very strange feeling.
It really is. But before we explore what might drive those summer prices up or down, I need to highlight a critical caveat regarding VA benefits. We established that standard disability compensation mirrors the Social Security COLA timeline.
Yes.
However, if you are utilizing specific vocational or educational benefits, you operate on a completely different calendar.
That is a very important distinction to make.
Yeah.
If you are using VRNE, the Veterans Readiness and Employment Program, your subsistence allowance does not wait for the Social Security timeline in January.
Right.
The same applies to Chapter 35 benefits, which is the Dependents Educational Assistance Program.
Wait, so they don't follow the January timeline at all?
No, those particular educational and vocational benefits are calculated directly by the Department of Veterans Affairs, and they implement those increases at the start of the new federal fiscal year.
Oh, which begins on October 1st.
Exactly. The VA uses earlier inflation data to set those rates, meaning if you rely on those programs, your timeline for seeing a financial increase is vastly accelerated compared to standard disability.
That is really good to know. But moving back to the broader CLA, we are in a waiting game where a sudden spike in living costs over this summer could result in a much higher adjustment.
Definitely.
And Mary Johnson issued a very specific warning that the relief we saw in June might be incredibly short-lived. The economy doesn't exist in a vacuum, and there are massive geopolitical forces at play right now that could immediately reverse the cooling trend.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are entirely at the mercy of global oil markets to dictate our domestic grocery budget.
We really are.
And the data reflects a very volatile situation right now. President Donald Trump recently declared an end to the ceasefire that had paused tensions in Iran, stating clearly that the U.S. would resume fighting over the Strait of Hormuz.
And for anyone who might need a quick economic geography refresher, the Strait of Hormuz isn't just some random waterway.
Not at all.
It is arguably the most critical maritime choke point in the entire world when it comes to the global oil trade. A massive percentage of the world's total petroleum consumption passes through that narrow stretch of water between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
Roughly 20 to 30% of the world's total oil supply flows through there.
That's huge.
It is. When you have a choke point that concentrated, any conflict, or frankly, even the mere political threat of a conflict, sends immediate shockwaves through global commodities markets.
Right, because traders begin pricing in the risk of supply disruptions.
Exactly. If tensions escalate with Iran and commercial shipping through the strait is affected, the price of a barrel of crude oil is going to surge.
Bringing us right back to the mechanism of the CPI-W. A surge in crude oil directly translates to a surge in refined gasoline prices at your local pump.
And recall that the primary reason inflation dropped in June was because gas prices fell by 9.7%. So if the situation in the Middle East causes gas prices to spike back up during our critical window of July, August, and September, it will dramatically drag the overall inflation average up with it.
Wow.
Johnson noted that with these ongoing tensions, it is entirely unclear whether the June drop in inflation can be sustained through the end of the calculation window.
It is staggering to think about how deeply interconnected this mathematical formula is. I mean, a geopolitical decision regarding a maritime strait in the Middle East directly dictates the poverty line for a veteran relying on a fixed pension in the Midwest.
It really does.
That feels incredibly fragile. Is anyone in Washington trying to decouple our benefits from this volatile, unpredictable math?
Well, there is active movement on that front. Lawmakers are attempting to address the inadequacy of the current COLA formula through domestic legislation. In June, Congress officially reintroduced the Social Security 2100 Act.
Okay, I have seen a lot of headlines about the 2100 Act, but the details often get buried. How does this legislation actually alter the landscape for beneficiaries if it manages to pass?
The Social Security 2100 Act is essentially designed to increase and expand benefits across the board, completely independent of whatever the CPI-W calculation dictates.
Oh, completely independent.
Yeah. The cornerstone of the bill proposes raising benefits by a flat 2% for all beneficiaries.
Okay, so a 2% bump right off the top. If the standard COLA lands at, say, 3.8%, this act would effectively layer an additional 2% on top of it, purely through legislative action.
Exactly. It acts as an override to ensure the math doesn't leave people behind during prolonged periods of baseline inflation.
That'd be huge.
It also includes provisions for specifically increasing the minimum benefit for lower-income seniors, ensuring that the most vulnerable populations get a dedicated layer of financial protection. But perhaps the most transformative aspect of the Act for public workers is the proposal to fully repeal the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset.
The WEP and the GPO. I know those acronyms send a shiver down the spine of a lot of federal and public sector workers.
Oh, absolutely.
But let's explain the actual mechanism of how they penalize people. Because a lot of veterans transition out of the military and take jobs as teachers, police officers, or state employees where they might not pay into Social Security.
Right. The windfall elimination provision is basically a mathematical formula adjustment.
Okay.
Normally, Social Security replaces about 90% of your first tier of average earnings. But if you also receive a pension from a job where you didn't pay Social Security taxes like certain state government roles, the WEP alters the formula. It drops that 90% replacement factor down to as low as 40%.
Wow. Which strips hundreds of dollars directly out of your monthly check.
Yep.
You paid into the system during your private sector or military years, but because you also earned a public pension, the government artificially reduces your return on investment.
That is exactly how it functions in practice. The government pension offset does something very similar, but it targets spousal and survivor benefits, often wiping them out entirely.
Wiping them out entirely. That's devastating.
It is. Repealing the WEP and GPO would be a massive structural correction. It would return a substantial amount of earned money to dual-hatted public workers who have been, mathematically penalized by those offsets for decades.
So you essentially have two completely different tracks running simultaneously right now.
Yeah.
On one track, you have the automatic COLA calculation being blindly driven by global oil prices and summer inflation data. And on the other track, you have lawmakers attempting to manually push a structural increase through Congress with the 2100 Act. Both tracks end up at the exact same destination, determining your financial stability next year.
It really emphasizes why veterans must monitor both the raw economic data and the legislative updates. Neither operates independently of the other when it comes to shaping your financial future.
Which brings us to the real-world application of this deep dive. Let's recap the top 3 takeaways you need to walk away with today.
Sounds good. Number 1. The current 2027 COLA projections are hovering between 3.7% and 3.8%. Even factoring in a recent cooldown in June inflation, this projection remains a full percentage point higher than last year's 2.8% adjustment.
Right. And number 2, the final increase you see in your checks is strictly determined by inflation data updated during the 3-month window of July, August, and September of this year. June set the stage, but the late summer data ultimately writes the script.
Exactly. And number 3, massive wildcards are currently at play. Global geopolitical events affecting oil prices, such as the end of the ceasefire with Iran and tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, could dramatically spike inflation right in the middle of our calculation window.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, legislative interventions like the Social Security 2100 Act could structurally alter your final benefits if signed into law.
So here's a practical action you can take right now. Over the next 2 months, pay close attention to your local gas prices and your grocery receipts. If you are feeling the pinch at the pump in August and September, it is a very strong indicator that your final COA percentage is heading upward.
Definitely.
And as always, remember to verify your exact new rates through official VA sources once the final numbers are announced in October.
Staying engaged with the process is vital. When you understand the mechanism behind the math, you can budget and plan for your family's future with actual confidence, rather than just waiting to see what the government decides to send you.
It makes you wonder, though, if a single localized conflict in the Strait of Hormuz can fundamentally alter the poverty line for millions of veterans in America by swinging the price of gas. Are we measuring the cost of living the wrong way entirely?
That's a great question.
Should a veteran's ability to afford housing and health care really be tethered to the volatility of global crude oil.
That is exactly the structural debate we need to be having in Washington right now.
So, how is inflation impacting your family's budget this summer? And do you feel a 3.8% increase would actually bridge the gap? Let us know in the comments below. We read them, and it helps us understand the reality you are facing on the ground. Thank you for watching Veterans Briefing. Take care, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next episode.